Our story
There
in
has
this
been no
hour
more
is one of
thoughtful
the-
journalist in the past 20 years than Bill Moyers. Trained as a Baptist preacher, honed in the service of President Lyndon Johnson, urged for years to run for office himself, Moyers found a way to express his deepest interests through broadcast reporting. Following that road, he has become one of the most serious, insightful voices on American television. Join Lee Cullum for a special hour-long conversation with Bill Moyers.
Bill Moyers, you have been a man of politics. There were years when everybody expected that you would run for political office, but you've been true to your calling. And to my mind, you've become one of the most important, serious broadcast journalists of your generation. And in recent years, the last 10 years or so, it seems to me you gravitated from politics to religion and spiritual matters. Is that where you feel the most at home?
Well, it's interesting that I do a lot of conventional journalism. I still do political documentaries, economic documentaries, documentaries about social issues, critical problems. Just did a 2-hour special recently on PBS on the funding of public education. And yet, when I do an occasional special or series on religious, philosophical, or spiritual issues, they seem to resound like the clap of cymbals, which says to me that this is a neglected beat for journalists, that we have spent a lot of time over the last 25 years covering economics, covering politics, covering government, finance, business, international affairs, sports, wrestling, everything except religion. And that when you do turn your spotlight on it, people are there to watch and respond.
You were born in Hugo, Oklahoma.
Not far from here, right across the Red River.
That's right. Grew up in Marshall, Texas. Went to the University of Texas and spent some time at the University of Edinburgh.
Went to North Texas State for 2 years before transferring to the university.
I didn't know that.
Yes, so I
Good
have
for you.
a lot of married a Dallas girl.
Yes, that showed very good judgment. And
Best
then
thing I ever
you
did.
got a master's at the Texas, what is it, the Southwestern Baptist Theological
Yes.
Seminary. Were you seriously considering entering the ministry at that point in your life?
I thought about it, but I was more inclined toward teaching in a religious institution. In fact, when I graduated from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, I had already been accepted to do my PhD in American civilization at the University of Texas. I was going to study the First Amendment, the whole issue of separation of church and state, and teach while I was doing that at Baylor University. But then there came another call, a telephone call from Lyndon Johnson, the United States Senator from this state, and the Democratic Majority Leader in the Senate, whom I had known before, for whom I had worked in Austin at his radio and TV station, asking me to take part in the campaign of 1960, and I did. I had started out in 1954 as a journalist at North Texas State to be a political journalist. Got interested in religion because I come out of a religious culture and out of a Baptist background, and strongly influenced by my parents and the church to think about religious journalism, religious teaching, something like that. But I once did an interview with Joseph Campbell, the great teacher of mythology, as you know, and he said, at the moment you're living your life, you rarely appreciate that there is a pattern to it. But when you look back, you see that there was an unfolding, that one thing led to another as gradually and as naturally as a tree rising from the soil. So in effect, my life has taken that course, and I found my natural bent, I think.
Do you feel that you've in some way been two different people inside yourself, the political man, the man of religion?
No, I
Have
don't.
you had to integrate those two?
I think they are integrated. I mean, I don't consider I have many interests, but I think that I'm one person, and I have an interest in politics, but that's natural to my interest in religion. I love the whole idea of democracy. I love the conversation of democracy, and that involves everything and everybody. But of course, as a journalist, like all journalists, like you and my other colleagues, I have a franchise to explore things I don't understand. And since there's a lot that I don't understand, I have an endless agenda. And I've been privileged as a broadcaster in public television, as long as I can raise every penny for every production, to go where my curiosity leads. I've often said that I'm a beachcomber on the shores of other people's knowledge and experience. I gather the materials and weave them into a production that you might benefit from. It's been a great life.
It was 1960 when you went to work for Lyndon Johnson, and that was the year he ran for president for the first time. And it was the first year that I can remember when the primaries showed themselves to be important. Yet Johnson stayed in Washington working in the Senate while Jack Kennedy stormed the primaries, won the nomination, then won the election with Johnson as his running mate. Do you think that this primacy of the primaries has been good for American politics?
I have mixed feelings about it. It certainly has has opened the process up, taking it away from the so-called smoke-filled rooms of the corridors of power. But it's also left a terrible burden on candidates now. They have to go so many places, raise so much money, campaign for so long, that I think the pendulum has swung too far, that it's gone beyond what we hoped with the primaries in democratizing the process and laying a terrible tax on the candidates and on the people. The candidates have to raise too much money. They have to spend too much time stroking rich contributors and then massaging voters in different states. And the public has to pay attention too long. Somehow we need another round of serious reform that A, shortens the campaigns, B, offers television time to the candidates so that they can be addressing the people instead of raising money, funding the campaigns from other sources than relatively few wealthy corporations and individuals, and finally, finding a way to require the candidates to speak in their own voice. Even though I helped initiate the use of television commercials in political campaigns, I'm appalled at what we did and what people do now. And I really think we should require that you can only attack your opponent or make an allegation about your opponent if you go on camera yourself and take accountability for your credibility. So I think there's a mixture of reforms that we have to go through if we don't wind up driving more and more people. Less than half of the qualified voters, as you know, voted in the last election. We can't continue that trend or we will not have our democracy anymore.
It seems commonplace among pundits today to say that great parliamentarians don't make great presidents. Do you think that's true?
We still have to prove that great parliamentarians can make good presidents. Lincoln was a great president, an effectual legislator. Franklin Roosevelt had been a good governor and became a great president. Dwight Eisenhower, I think, was a really fine president, had no parliamentary experience. There's a difference in leadership and legislation. In legislation, the leader's job is to get consensus, to get compromise, to get you to give up a little, Lee, and me to give up a little, so we come out with something
As Lyndon Johnson did.
That was his great strength, to move the process incrementally forward. A national leader, a president, has to use the bully pulpit to speak and summon us to a collective action, and that's different from parliamentary process. Bob Dole, I think, was a good man, is a good man, but he was not a national leader. He was a truly effective backroom operator, trying to reach consensus among 55 Republicans in the House and coordinate and collaborate with his Democratic allies and adversaries. He was very good at that, but he didn't have the public persona. He didn't have the ability to project a message. He didn't have the voice or the appearance. I'm sorry to say that Abraham Lincoln probably would not be elected if he had to campaign today, or Franklin Roosevelt, maybe even Harry Truman, because this is a new age. I remember the first time I heard Lyndon Johnson speak. It was on the Courthouse Square, 1948. He was running for the Senate. He came to Marshall, Texas, spoke outside the courthouse there, had no loudspeaker. He had to project with his physical being his persona on an audience of 2,000 or 3,000 people on a hot July day. I don't remember a word he said, but I remember that he forced himself upon us. You can't do that today. Television is a very intimate medium. It's a very subtle medium. People don't want you in your living room shouting at you. And Lyndon Johnson didn't adjust well to television. And many modern politicians, like Bob Dole, doesn't. Bill Clinton is enormously telegenic.
Yes. After Jack Kennedy was elected president, you became assistant director and then deputy director of the Peace Corps, and it certainly rekindled idealism among Americans, especially American youth. That seems to me to have gotten lost. What is it going to take to recapture idealism in America?
As usual, Lee, you ask a good and hard question. I don't know. There is a lot of idealism in America. There are a lot of people doing community work. There are a lot of young people who were involved this last summer in political activity. There are people right here in the communities in the metropolitan Dallas area who feed the homeless and try to shelter the sick and do a lot of things like that, still active with young people. But something has happened to the belief of a lot of people, perhaps the majority of people, that I can matter significantly, that I can make a difference. My generation was bred on that, the belief that I'm only one, but I still am one, that I can't do everything, but I can do something. And then Jack Kennedy came along and gave a summons to all of us to get involved in something that we really thought was was going to make a difference in the world. And I think the Peace Corps didn't change the world, but it changed the hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people who participated in it. Now it's hard to get that stirred up.
On November 22nd, 1963, the day Jack Kennedy was assassinated here in Dallas and Lyndon Johnson hastily sworn in as president aboard Air Force One, you passed a note to the president saying, "I'm here if you need me." What did Johnson need most from you in those terrible hours?
Energy, confidentiality. I've never written a book about LBJ because I spent so many hours and days with him when he was just issuing a stream of consciousness from somewhere deep within, expressing his frustrations and bouncing ideas off of me and jousting with them, and certain that I was not going to be the thief of his confidence. I was not going to turn those moments into some kiss and tell book. What he really needed was a young man who was energetic and completely loyal to the confidentiality that he needed at that time, and somebody whom he could use as a sounding board. I wasn't the only one. There was Jack Valenti, who was on that flight going back, Liz Carpenter, who was on that flight going back. He needed some familiar faces around him as he was thrust into a wholly new arena.
You moved to the White House as assistant to the president, then as press secretary, and as I understand it, you became almost a son to Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson. You played a pivotal role when he had surgery. How would you describe your relationship with him? It must have been complex.
It was very complex. Lyndon Johnson was 13 of the most interesting people I ever met, all in one. He could be and was the best dancer in the White House since George Washington, and yet 24 hours later he could be as boorish as Andrew Jackson, who was raised in the back country of the Carolinas. He could be magnanimous, generous, but at the same time, a few hours later, he could be petty and tormenting. He was a troubled man. He was a gifted man. As I said, he knew how to get things done, but he was a very troubled man. It was hard working with him. You had to run to stay up with Lyndon Johnson when he was walking. And yet he drew the best out of you. There wasn't a hint of scandal in the Johnson White House. No one was ever, as was the case of either the Clinton administration or the Nixon administration, in hot water for ethical dealings. He had his problems with Bobby Baker before he got to the White House, but he demanded a high level of energy and commitment to public service. But he was a very, very complex and difficult man, tortured by some inner demons that I still haven't been able to identify. But he wanted to do right by the country once he was president, and he did some good things, and had it not been for Vietnam, I think he would be one of the towering presidents of our century.
As time went on during his term of office, Johnson became more and more resentful and fearful of the Kennedys, especially Bobby Kennedy, who left the Attorney General's office and ran for the Senate from New York. And the moment came where people around Johnson were saying, I heard them say, that you were a closet Kennedy file, a secret Kennedy file. This must have been difficult for you. Did you feel in an awkward position?
Well, anytime you're misunderstood, it's difficult. But the very reason that I was effective in the 1960 campaign is that I was a bridge between the Kennedy and Johnson camps. That was my job, to be the liaison on the LBJ plane with the Kennedy plane. Don't ask me why, but I was very good at listening and talking to the Boston Irishmen and translating them to the Texans and vice versa. For some reason, I still don't understand it. I spoke well, understood shorthand with Larry O'Brien, Kenneth O'Donnell, and all the crowd around Kennedy. And I was a very effective interpreter between those two difficult personas in the campaign of 1960. The reason neither Kennedy or Johnson wanted me to go to the Peace Corps was because on the vice president's staff, the Kennedy people felt that I was the one they could really, one of those few they could talk to and be understood, and that they could understand LBJ from the translation back to them. So I've had the same experience with Bobby Kennedy. My loyalty was to Lyndon Johnson, but I was able to talk to Bobby Kennedy. I had one important session with him in which I persuaded him to change his position on an issue that would have been a bone of contention between RFK and JFK, and to change it in favor of the president. But a lot of people, you never have time to stop and explain yourself when you're working in those frenetic days of intense 18-hour activity. And so when people thought that my conversations with Bobby Kennedy were somehow disloyal to LBJ, didn't really know what I was doing.
Finally, you left the White House and you became publisher of Newsday on Long Island. How did the editorial page of that paper treat the Johnson administration, and especially Vietnam?
Well, the owner of the newspaper, Harry Guggenheim, insisted on on his editorial policy. He was strongly in favor of Vietnam, and he liked Lyndon Johnson except on domestic policy. And he endorsed on the editorial page Richard Nixon for president. But he was a gracious and generous man and allowed me, the publisher, to endorse Hubert Humphrey on the op-ed page. So he had his editorial supporting Nixon and his reasons for it, and I had my reasons for supporting Hubert Humphrey. But once I left the White House, Lee, I took the vow of journalism. I made no more contributions to the Democratic Party. I do not consider myself a partisan. I endorsed Republicans on Long Island on the editorial page if I thought they were better than many of the mediocre Democratic candidates. I think in the 3 years that I published Newsday, we wound up endorsing 19 Republicans and 18 Democrats. And in my journalism since then, I've really avoided the partisan route. I turned down President Carter when he asked me to come to the White House as his chief of staff. I turned down a chance to go to the White House with Bill Clinton. I turned down the Secretary of Education's job when President Carter asked me to consider it. I just felt that I had crossed the divide. The waters had parted and rolled back over, and I was on the side of journalism and not politics.
In 1971, you moved to broadcasting, and you've been in broadcasting ever since. And you were with PBS primarily. You also did some work for CBS. I know you do some things for NBC now. But those years in the 70s were the years people most often mentioned you as a political candidate. Were you ever close to taking the plunge?
No. No, I wasn't. I had people come to me when I moved to New York. The New York Daily News, when I announced my resignation from the White House as the press secretary to go to publish Newsday, which was a New York newspaper, said, well, he's clearly coming up here to establish a political base. News to me, I was going to establish a journalism base. Then before Moynihan ran for the Senate in New York, some Democrats came to me and said, you've had experience in Washington, would you run? We'll raise the money. I said, no, I'm in journalism. That's where I want to stay. Once you have been on the stage in Washington, people read into you their own aspirations or their own tea leaves or their own hopes for you, or see you in a way that you don't see yourself. And many people over the years, not now because time has passed and it's too late, have urged me to go into politics. But while I had a deep interest in politics and still do, I love politics, I love the democratic process, I have not been tempted to go into politics.
One of the best shows you did, the most powerful shows you did in those early years in broadcasting was on Watergate. How do you think history will treat Nixon and that unhappy episode?
I think he would be judged harshly for what was happening, for the actual criminal violations that took place on the part of his members of his cabinet and his White House staff. I think those were serious and sordid, and he will be judged harshly. But historians will also put that in the context. He will always be the only president, up until now, who had to resign the office under that sort of cloud, who would have been impeached. I think, as already has happened, they will, however, once they go beyond that, see that Richard Nixon was a patriot, that he had his dark side, but he also had his inspired moments, particularly in the field of foreign policy. He kept and increased many of the Democratic programs of the 1960s in domestic policy, and I think that will be well analyzed and well saluted when salutes are in order. But you never, once that happens, once you've resigned the presidency, that's always going to be the lead in your obituary.
How do you feel about the rise of the religious right in American politics?
They belong in the conversation. They'd been inactive and passive and indifferent for a long time and had not been heard. And I think, like all groups, they belong in the democratic conversation. It's open to everybody. The arena should be. I'm disturbed because they are so often malicious and mean-spirited. They don't just debate their enemies, they try to destroy their enemies. I'm curious as to some of their positions. I mean, take a small one. Ralph Reed has his Christian Coalition contract with the American family. One of the planks is the elimination of public broadcasting. Now,
we've got to get Big Bird out of the American home.
Yeah, actually the only two major candidates who lost in the last election were Bob Dole and Larry Pressler, senator from South Dakota, and both of them had opposed public broadcasting, wanted to eliminate public broadcasting. So there, politicians, just kidding. But I read the Bible. I don't find it calling for the elimination of public broadcasting. The religious right has been both too partisan in my judgment. You should never make the church, any church, a precinct of a political party. I object to Jesse Jackson's turning black churches into precincts of the Democratic Party. I think God is beyond politics. I think it's wonderful when you come into the arena to champion your positions on the basis of your religious and moral positions. But you have to acknowledge that in a political democracy, in a secular society, your religious vision is not going to be the dominant one. Otherwise, we'll have a theocracy and not a democracy. And I also resent the domination of the political religious discourse by the religious right with some complicity from the press. Every time Ralph Reed holds a press conference, it's taken as big news. Sometimes I think they have reduced religion to nothing, Lee, but one more interest group like the National Rifle Association or the National Association of Manufacturing, and that they see Moses and Jesus as lobbyists in their Gucci's prowling the corridors of Congress advocating a tax break. I mean, they're not the only ones concerned about religion. Millions of evangelical Christians, conservative evangelical Christians, millions of Jews and Catholics are good Christians but disagree with the religious right. And it's time now for these other Christians, Jews, and other religious believers to get into the conversation and challenge the religious right. Everybody belongs in it, but nobody can monopolize it.
And we have to render unto Caesar
Exactly.
the things that are Caesar's.
Exactly.
Let's talk about your Joseph Campbell series. It had enormous impact. Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth. What was it about mythology that was so compelling to American audiences, do you think? What is the power of myth?
Well, I did Joseph Campbell because I just knew him as a wonderful teacher. I had no idea this series would have the impact it did. It aired with no publicity, no paid promotion, and it got a rating of 1, which is a very small rating by television standards. But within 3 weeks, people were calling the stations, requesting reruns. Word of mouth spread. There were at least 2,000 discussion groups that spontaneously sprung up, watching the series and talking about it. Somehow Joseph Campbell touched a chord by giving us a new vocabulary for talking about spirituality, for what it means to be spiritual. I'll give you an example. There was one moment when we were having a very intense exchange, and I was struggling to try to rephrase what he said and what he was saying so that the audience would get it. And I said to him, "You're talking about the meaning of life." And he said, "Oh, no, my boy. I'm not talking about the meaning of life. I'm talking about the experience of being alive, the rapture of the moment, not looking for some deep or hidden meaning, but just appropriating, apprehending, and experiencing this moment." Well, a light went off in my head. And I thought that is a way to look at our lives, that we may not find meaning in suffering. We may not find meaning in this or that approach, but we can experience the life, the moment, here and now, in a rich and, as he would say, rapturous way. So somehow in a way, he helped us to see the great stories of creation and redemption and forgiveness with a universal application that made us all see each other differently. And I think that was his power. On the other hand, I don't really know. Sometimes I don't know why people respond to things I do. I will do something I think is very important, and there's silence out there. People are either not impressed or not paying attention. Sometimes I do something that's only of interest to me, and the light goes on.
Joseph Campbell said in his interview with you that the time comes when the cares of the day have been accounted for and suddenly you turn to the inner life. But if you don't know where it is or what it is, you're going to be in trouble. It seems to me that you have attended to your inner life through a very, very busy schedule. How have you managed that? Is it a matter of habit?
It's a matter of effort. One has to work at one's inner life. It doesn't just lie there like a house pet waiting to be stroked. You have to cultivate it. I've actually been helped by my work. I've learned a lot from people and experiences I've had in journalism. I mean, I'm a Baptist. I consider myself still a Baptist. I'm a Christian first and a Baptist second. But I'm a better Baptist for what I've learned from the Buddhist about the serenity of the inner life. I'm a better Baptist for what I learned from the Muslims about the mystical notion of a union with God, and from the Confucianists about the need for social harmony. But I work on my inner life. I practice meditation, which is a way of trying to go within and quiet the mind. My mind, like yours, I'm sure, is a monkey in a tree hopping from one limb to another. Sometimes I just cannot quiet it. I want to take a bat and knock it down so I can sleep. But meditation, contemplation, yoga, which is available to people of all faiths and no faith, are techniques of learning to cope with the busyness of the mind and to shut out the freneticism of the day and to go in like prayer. It is a form of prayer and quieting the roiling waters so that there are moments of peace and serenity. I read a lot. I read widely. That reading nurtures me. I suspect I get more ideas from reading than I do any other place, and that is a constant fertilizing and nourishing of the inner soil. So you have to work at it.
You said that Joseph Campbell has many faces of God, and he calls them masks of eternity. And you said that God wears a different mask in different cultures. And you also pointed out in that particular program that there are many religions that have creation stories and stories of virgin births and incarnations and last judgments and second comings. So with all these things in common, why is it that some people really have difficulty honoring other faiths? What would Joseph Campbell say about that?
He would quarrel with what causes a lot of people to do that, which is the sense that if I have the truth, then you must be living a lie. And if I have the truth, I'm obligated to share it with you, even if in some areas of history, I have to impose it on you. That's when religion's gotten in trouble. Joe Campbell, as I do, quarrel with that kind of belligerent Christianity. Religion has a killing side. The history of religion, the first murder begins in the book of Genesis with a religious act. Two brothers, Cain and Abel, bring an offering to God. God, playing favorites, chooses the offering of the younger over the elder. The elevation of the elder leads to the humiliation of the younger, and Cain kills Abel. They both were making an offering, and one of them winds up dead. And once that happens, it's repeated in the stories of Esau and Jacob, Ishmael and Isaac, Joseph and his brothers, right on down to the generations of Muslims versus Jews, Christians versus Muslims, Jews versus Muslims, etc., until the thread of religiously spilled blood runs right from east of Eden to Bosnia, Beirut, and Belfast. Religion has a killing side. It also has a healing side. And it's that side that we need to nurture. And a lot of people think that if they have the insight into God, they are somehow chosen in a way that causes others to be inferior. There's a wonderful writer from North Dakota named Kathleen Norris. She wrote a book a few years ago called Dakota, wrote a book this last year called The Cloistered Walk, and has a little book of poetry out. And in one of her poems she says, "We're all God's chosen now. God help us because of it." In other words, the real summons of religion is to humility, not to pride. So Campbell would quarrel with an imperial, aggressive religion of any kind that tried to say, this is the truth and the only truth.
You said also in the Joseph Campbell series that Jesus and the Buddha, Muhammad, all came from afar, bringing with them the wonder of God. Not a blueprint of God, the wonder of God. And you said then the writers of creeds and theologians arrive and the wonder gets lost. Has that happened today? Do we have too much theology and too little wonder, do you think?
I think there's a lot of that. Yes, I think there's some truth in that. There are people, I know people who are still alive with the spirit of wonder and openness. They look at the Bible, for example, as a wonderful book, but it has to be approached with an open heart, and they keep discovering in there revelations that occur to this very moment. I happen to think that creation is not over, that we all are part of continuing the work of the original act of creation. But there are people who just read the Bible or read their sacred texts as if they were bumper stickers and sound bites, as if they were Chinese cookies which you opened and there was a philosophy just waiting for you to swallow. That's not the way I found it. It may be good for you, fine if it is, but it's not the way it works for me. For me, life and faith are continuing explorations and adventures. I mean, look, God virtually disappears from the Hebrew Bible after the encounter with Job. And one of the participants in my Genesis seminar, Renita Weems, a great African-American woman theologian at Vanderbilt University, says faith is the experience, faith is what you do between one experience with God and another experience with God. And sometimes that can be a long, dry spell. And for me, that's the way I find it. I wish I had the easy comfort of the kind of prescripted faith that some people take away from their own sacred text. I don't. It's a continuing wrestling, as with Jacob in the middle of the night.
Looking at the 20th century and theology through the 20th century, I look at the first half and I see Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr and Martin Buber, great, towering theologians. And it seems we've had a decline in theology in the last half of the 20th century. Do you think so?
I hadn't thought about it, but yes, you're right, but I have to enlarge the comment. Where are the great philosophers,
exactly.
The great political scientists?
Well, the philosophers are concerned with technical things. They want to be technically correct, so I'm told. So sweeping ideas, deep ideas, elude them.
And where are the great statesmen? Where are the Churchills, people like that? I don't know. It's an interesting time. It may be that I think the real test of an institution, a society, perhaps a species, is not in the periods of comfort and pleasure, but in the periods of controversy, challenge, and confrontation. And it may be that the early part of this century, which was a period of such great upheaval, was ripe for the great minds to address and try to analyze and deduce. And maybe we're living in such a different time now. I don't know the answer to that question, but there are no sweeping, transcendent theologians like those you mentioned, or statesmen, or even novelists that I think equal the depth and complexity of a Faulkner or some of the early European writers, James Joyce and people like that.
The earth has been stripped of mystery. You've said so yourself. And I have heard others say that we're suffering from a loss of the sacred. How can we recapture the sacred and a sense of mystery? Do you think ritual helps?
I think ritual helps, but it's hard to just restore ritual or restore any institution that has outlived its usefulness. We need a new story. To me, there is a great deal of mystery. I love to read the Bible now because I now see it not as I did growing up in East Texas, at 10 feet tall, with characters larger than life and somehow immune to the tensions and pressures of life. The people in Genesis are people like you and me. They don't always do the right thing. They don't always know what the right thing to do is. They don't know what to make of God, and as I read the stories, God doesn't know what to make of them. They live with ambiguity. They cannot come up with a bumper sticker for every crisis. There are no great moral lessons to draw from these stories. And yet, these people like you and me, were the instruments of a great transcendent unfolding of history and the creation of a people of God. So I think that there's nothing we face in the 21st century more daunting than what they faced 3,000, 4,000 years ago, and that leaves me somewhat hopeful. But to me, the Bible is still full of both contradictions and mysteries, and life is full of contradictions and mystery. I mean, you are a mystery to me sitting there. Where did you come from? How are you who you are and what you are? And that kind of challenge of understanding another human being is repeated in the challenge of understanding yourself. I think the sense of the sacred has to come with reinvesting ourselves in the search for a new story. To me, the most interesting story of our times is emerging in the intersection between the spiritual and the secular. It's the search for a new vision for America that has the power and authority of a religious vision, but is inclusive and not sectarian. This is a pluralistic country. America is home to all the world's religions now. I was in San Jose, California recently, Lee, and 80 different tongues are spoken there. dozens of different religions, minarets, mosques, ashrams, temples, Catholic cathedrals, congregational churches, right here in Dallas. I mean, I read the Dallas Morning News, as I said to you earlier before we started talking, and I've been following the clash of cultures, the clash of opinions, the clash of beliefs in Dallas with the Hispanics and the blacks and the Anglos. I mean, this country is remaking itself right before our eyes, and we have to find a way to tell our new American story that is inclusive so that we can all find our place in it. That to me is a sacred investment, a sacred challenge to invest in this journey, the kind of significance that reflects the origins of our creation, which have to be in mystery and transcendence.
You did a series called World of Ideas. It was both a television series and a book, and you talked with pivotal thinkers of the day. One of those thinkers was Barbara Tuchman, and she says this nation is suffering from a loss of honor. Was she right?
Well, I certainly was impressed with what she said, and I think while I know many honorable people, we've lost the other side of the coin. We've lost the shame that produces honor. It's almost impossible to imagine anything today that is so shameful that it costs the wrongdoer in public prosperity or presence. I mean, look at Richard Morris, the president's man who was exposed in a contradiction between the values he was urging the president to espouse and promote and campaign on in his own life. Made $2.5 million out of that revelation, and is a consultant today to candidates in Germany and other places. Once upon a time, that kind of transgression revealed in public would have required repentance and remorse before there would be forgiveness. Now we just leap over the stages of repentance, remorse, and forgiveness to writing the check to reward the celebrity. Until we return to a sense of shame, that there are some things we cannot espouse as a society, and that if they are occurring, then we have to be penalized for perpetuating them. We have to return to a sense of shame, I think, before we will restore a sense of honor.
Carlos Fuentes was in your World of Ideas series, and I heard him say this. He said, "I'd rather be a Greek than an Aztec. I'd rather wrestle with things alien to me than die of astonishment, as the Aztecs did when they beheld Cortez." How do you think Americans are doing wrestling with things alien to them?
I wish I could remember my work as well as you do.
Well, your work is very compelling.
Well, I should go back to the previous question about honor. I know many Americans who live honorable lives. They're anonymous. They're not celebrated in the media. They don't get airtime. They don't make a lot of money, but they go up, they raise their children as faithfully as they can. They perform their work as honorably as they can. They fulfill their responsibility in the community with fidelity that does not depend upon notoriety. They go about making the best of their lives as they can. I think, in fact, most people do that. But somehow, it seems to me that an alien ideology has slipped into America, which holds that we are nothing more than the sum of our appetites, and that America is nothing but an economic machine. And if that's the case, we never are able to define enough. Enough's enough is a wonderful old saying, and knowing when enough's enough is very important to the maturity of a civilization. I think, given the fact that America is judged today and success is judged by more of everything, the treadmill's broken. It's spinning. There's no governor to it anymore. I mean, some invisible foot has pressed the accelerator all the way to the door. I come back to Dallas. It's an incredible city. It's exploding with growth, and yet I see these freeways and highways being cut through residential areas, so that it's very hard for people who are trying to live quiet lives to have quiet lives. I go through residential areas now where you've had to put turtles up in the streets, the speed bumps to stop people from racing through, because people are in such a frenzy to get from one place to another. Somehow, and I think this goes back to an earlier question you asked me about what people are searching for, the very genius of American capitalism, which is rampant at the moment and has almost no checks and balances. Even as people become more prosperous or discovering they're having to run faster, work harder, do 2 jobs, work longer hours, something is missing in that. That isn't answering the deeper questions or providing the quality of life or the sense of community that people want. And that's why they're turning back honorably, in many cases, to search, to compose some response to what seems to be an untrammeled and an unchecked race for more and more. And until we find balance again in our lives, in our society, in our economy, I think people are going to be conflicted in the success that America enjoys economically and the sense of dis-ease and discomfort and dislocation left by that success.
You did a series called Healing in the Mind. What did you learn from that series about maintaining a healthy mind and therefore we have to hope a healthy body?
Well, I learned a lot from the folks here at the Parkland Hospital, because the Parkland Hospital, where they're trying to introduce Ron Anderson, who was the CEO, still is the CEO, and David Smith, a wonderful public health officer who was working for the hospital then, trying to take the best techniques of Parkland Hospital out into the communities. He's now the commissioner of public health in Texas. They taught me a lot. What I learned, of course, is obvious, that emotions affect health, that people can die, quote, of a broken heart, that my own father's long-term inability to express his grief was in part and perhaps primarily responsible for the horrific headaches that he suffered up until the time of his death, that emotions are as important to our well-being as anything else. And I learned a lot about how different people come to grips with their emotions that lead to the kind of prevention of illness that is important if we're going to bring the cost down. Just an example, Dr. John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center has introduced meditation as a way for his patients in that hospital to cope with severe pain, chronic pain. People come to that hospital with broken necks. They come with migraine headaches that are furious in their relentless assault on the individual. They come in constant misery. And rather than drug them, John Kabat-Zinn teaches them how to use meditation to calm their minds and their emotions and to achieve a state of coexistence with that pain that actually diminishes the suffering. Now, it's called meditation. He doesn't call it that because he says Americans have a bias against meditation, although the root word of meditation is close to the root word of medicine. So what he does is call it stress reduction, and he teaches people how to reduce the stress in their lives. What he's really teaching them is a form of Buddhist meditation, and it really does work. In my own recovery from heart surgery, I was able to use meditation to cope with my tensions, with the fears that I had after that surgery. And even now on the road, I've been on the road for 2 months, and I get tired and I need renewing. Rather than take a nap, what I do is 25 or 35 or 40 minutes of meditation in which I have learned how to quiet the rolling waters, still the currents running beneath, and come out of that experience really emotionally and physically renewed. There is a connection.
Do you believe prayer can help cure disease?
I know that prayer can help the person who is diseased. I do not understand sufficiently how people are healed. There's just so much that I have to say as a journalist. I don't understand it. I have known people who prayed who were healed. I have known people who prayed who were not healed. I do not know what difference in the transformation or transactions takes place there, but I believe that prayer can, yes, I believe that prayer can heal us even when we're experiencing terminal illness, in the sense of healing being a coming to terms with the reality that cannot be ignored, in terms of making our way through troubled waters without falling from the lifeboat. Yes, I believe in prayer, and I believe that prayer is indispensable to understanding, accepting, and discovering the wonder of myself and the wonder of God.
Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis edited your book, Healing in the Mind, and also the Joseph Campbell book, and also the World of Ideas book, and maybe others at Doubleday. How did you find her as an editor and as a person?
Well, she was a wonderful, thoughtful colleague, and she was the supervisor. She was the shepherding angel, let's say, of these books. Those books were actually professionally edited by a wonderful Texan named Betty Sue Flowers, who's a friend and colleague of mine who teaches poetry and English at the University of Texas, and she edited the Campbell book, working with Jackie Onassis and with me. She edited the other books you mentioned, but Jackie Onassis, it was her idea to do them. I didn't think a book of interviews between Joseph Campbell and Bill Moyers would have any appeal. She saw a little item in the New York Times saying that I had been out at George Lucas's ranch in Skywalker Ranch in California interviewing Campbell. She called me up and said, let's print the transcripts. I said, that won't be an interesting book. She said, yes. She had an impeccable sense of what was desirable and doable and what ought to be done even when other people like me said, oh, it won't work. She had an exquisite sense of taste. And she thought this book would work, and it was. And she took a great interest in it, in the editing of it, worked with Betty Sue, and the art that was chosen for it, as she did in every subsequent book. My current book on Genesis was the last book I discussed with her. Judith, my wife, and I, who's my partner and wife, went over to have lunch with Jackie in January of 1994. And we talked. She said, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to do this series on Genesis. And she said, there's a book in it. I said, no, there's not a book in it. There are 8 people sitting around talking about these stories. You can't edit 8 people to make sense on the page. People will not follow the progression of thought with 8 different sources. She said, yes, just do it. I said, well, I'll think about it. Then I had heart surgery, and while I was in the hospital recovering from my bypass, she died. So that was the last conversation I had with her. And she very much inspirits this book of Genesis, which Betty Sue Flowers edited and my wife Judith created. My wife Judith, who is from Dallas County, designed the book, selected the art from it, and in the spirit of Jackie Onassis, she and Betty Sue Flowers produced this wonderful book.
Of course, Genesis has the 2 creation stories in it, and they're very controversial because some people say they're better science than Darwin. But you know, I've heard another way of looking at it, this from an Episcopal priest who said that actually these stories are metaphors, and they are metaphors that tell a deeper truth than any literal interpretation ever could. How do you feel about that?
Well, I know that a lot of people take these stories literally. I have a hard time doing that because of the incompatibilities and the contradictions. You're right, there are 2 stories in Genesis about creation. In one story, God creates humanity, male and female, simultaneously. No chronological preference, just instantaneously you and I emerge from Adam. In the other story, which follows shortly thereafter, God creates man first, and then from man's rib takes woman. And of course this has been the source of a lot of mischief, if not malevolence, as people have said chronology determines preference, and so who's created first must be better. I don't believe that. You could argue it the other way, as some of the women do in our series. In fact, some of the most interesting biblical theology is being done today by women, and some of the most fascinating participants in my series and book are women. And some women, feminist theologians will tell you, well, the fact that woman came second in this story means it was the crowning of creation. God started with the lower elements, went to man, and then it finished it off with the feminine. I can't get into that at all because I think that's misreading the text. I don't think it's relevant who or what is created first. I think the relevance is what we discover in these texts about God. And the Bible is a journey of discovery. It's not a revelation of fiat. It's not telling you explicitly that this was that, although I see why some people believe that. Myth is another thing. I'm not sure it's myth. I think these are real stories about concrete realities. And we have invested a lot in them over the years. Communities have accepted them as their source of religious truth, and I think they are a source of religious truth in the way that all great poetry is true. All great poetry speaks to the depth of the human experience, and I think these stories do. And I think that if you struggle with them, you will find in them revelation that can guide your life. But I also know enough to realize that different people see these stories differently, and I have to honor the fact that from their experience, I once said to a reporter back from Vietnam, who's telling the truth out there? He said, everyone. Everyone is telling what's happening through the lens of their own experience. So each of us brings to these stories our own experience and our own inner wrestling, like Jacob, with the presence of God in our lives. And we have to make of these stories what is right and good for our lives.
You do a program in the Genesis series on temptation. This is Adam and Eve in the garden. And I was struck by Elaine Pagels of Princeton, who said that in this story, human beings, Adam and Eve, are seen as distinct from nature. They are not involved in pain, suffering, and death. And they become involved in pain, suffering, and death because of their own fault. Do you accept that? Were human beings ever really not obliged to suffer and die?
We don't really know, do we?
No.
We don't really know. Where is the empirical, certifiable evidence that it was this or that? All we have is this story. I've often had sympathy for Eve. I mean, what does she do? She sees this fruit that is beautiful to look at, that offers pleasure, and that God has said will make Adam and Eve like gods, like us. So wisdom, knowledge. What's wrong with wanting wisdom, beauty, and pleasure? So Eve, acting out of this natural curiosity, reaches for it, and of course is punished in the story. Maybe the story is trying to tell us something about overreaching, about boundaries, even for boundaries for everything. You can have too much knowledge, you can have too much pleasure, you can have too much beauty. I don't know. I don't really know what it means. But I learn different possibilities by listening to people like Elaine Pagels and a wonderful evangelical Christian named Louis Smedes, who taught at Fuller Theological Seminary, by listening to the Muslims talk about this story because they wrestle with it as well, and listen to Jews talk about it. I lose nothing from my own faith by listening to other people talk about these stories. To the contrary, they teach me and I teach them. And that's the answer to the question of how we're going to make it as a democratic society with so many different pluralistic religions. I did a series earlier this year with the renowned philosopher and historian of religion, Houston Smith, called The Wisdom of Faith. A man who's almost 80, he's given his whole life to studying religion, comparative religions. I say to him, how can I hold my truth to be the truth when everybody else sees truth differently? And he said, it was one of those wonderful, thoughtful, eloquent silences on television when you actually saw someone thinking out loud on camera. He said, we listen. We listen as alertly to their description of reality and experience of reality as we hope they will listen to us. Now, to do that doesn't mean you have to surrender your own principal beliefs or desert your own faith. I don't think that to see how others see or to transcend the visible spectrum of feeling, you have to abandon your own beliefs. You just have to go deeper into your own religion and examine it in the light of what other people tell you has been their experience. And I found what Elaine Pagels and all the people in the book and the series say really informs my own journey, and I've learned from it. Don't always agree with. In fact, we have people from different faiths, different persuasions, as you know in the series. Our time together was enriched because we didn't come from the same neighborhood. You know, growing up in East Texas, I talked about the Bible with other Baptists, Presbyterians with other Presbyterians, Methodists with other Methodists, Jews with other Jews, but we never talked about it across those lines. And I never knew what they thought about these stories. Now I do, and the more we talked in our series, the more we disagreed. But despite our differences, the more we talked, the more we discovered that we often have a lot in common with people who are not like us.
Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. What is your bliss?
The search, the quest, the curiosity. Thomas More said that true conversation is an interpretation of worlds, an interpretation of worlds. And the reason I interview so many people is because I want to have them interpret their world for me. I'm not black. I have no idea what the black experience in America is. I'm not Jewish, have no idea except intellectually what that experience is. I'm not crippled, have no idea what it means to be facing a deforming illness or something like that. I'm not a woman. All I can know is what you tell me about what it means to you to be a woman. Interpret your world for me, Lee Cullum, and I will go away richer for first, having learned something, and second, having made a friend. And so my bliss is our meeting and our connection and our understanding that comes from spending some time together. I really mean that. I love being a student. I was a very good student at Marshall High School, North Texas State, and the University of Texas because I hated tests but loved the preparation. And so somewhere in that knowledge is information, somewhere in that information is wisdom, and somewhere in that wisdom is experience, and that's my bliss.